Welcome everyone once again to our mid-September Patreon crowdcast with Professor Ármann Jakobsson. And I'm going to just start getting going with some of the questions that were already submitted to use our time as best we can. Marcel Buxtedt and Sarah Passel had asked, how many authors of sagas do we know by name?
Yeah, this is not as easy a question as it might seem, because in Icelandic the word saga just means story, and almost all prose narratives are referred to as saga, even though it's narratives that we in English don't count as this part of the saga genre. So there are some narratives called saga that have a known author, but none of the sagas that English speakers normally call sagas, which is the Icelandic family sagas, have known authors. And this is mostly because the genre does not have a prologue. So the prologue is usually where the information about the author is given, and there are no prologues in family sagas, which is interesting. And therefore we don't really know who the authors are, which is actually quite liberating, especially because discussion about the author often tends to become more prominent than discussion of the actual text. But we who study the sagas are fortunate enough not to have an author who is in the way of our discussion of the text. But of course, a lot of saga scholarship, especially in the early 19th until the mid-20th century, concerned finding and identifying saga authors. This, I think, is slightly out of fashion for the last 50, 60 years, because it is almost impossible, because very few of the candidates have left any documents that are clearly by them. So it's hard to do any kind of scientific analysis. And of course, we don't have the preserved information. So the saga authors will probably remain unknown, but that doesn't mean we cannot discuss the sagas.
Right. I think that's a very optimistic take on it, that it's actually freeing not to know who the authors are.
I think so, because the idea that we know anything about an author is possibly a fallacy. Even when we have a lot of data concerning the author, it kind of gives an artificial impression that we know the person, whereas we don't really know anyone except ourselves, possibly, and possibly people we met slightly, but really data tends to obscure the fact that we don't really know anything. So that's one issue that we are free of in saga studies.
I appreciate that take on it.
Yeah.
Well, Payson Muller asks, I've heard it said that other Scandinavian countries, I think mainly Denmark, but maybe Norway under Sweden at the time, saw Iceland as a kind of archive for sacred texts and maybe even culture in a sense, because it was remote and removed from the turmoil of the rest of Europe in the medieval and later historic period. Do you know if there's evidence of this idea, or are other people talking about this?
Yes, it is a medieval idea. It's also very prominent in the 17th century. From the actual Middle Ages, we don't have many instances of this idea being clearly expressed, but we do have a mention in, I think it's Theodoricus and Saxo mention Icelanders as particularly valuable informants. And of course, there is the happy coincidence that most of the sagas are composed in Iceland. A lot of the poetry and prose narratives are preserved only in Iceland. So it's very likely that Iceland was thought of as a particularly interesting place for heritage. And then in the 17th century, we have this massive race between the Nordic superpowers, Denmark and Sweden, about who has the best access to the saga tradition, to the Icelandic medieval tradition. And so it's an old idea that Icelanders have particular access to the sagas. Of course, this remains so because the modern Icelandic spelling is based largely on medieval spelling. So there is an artificial resemblance between modern and medieval spelling, which doesn't quite reflect the actual spoken language. So it's hard for Icelandic children to learn spelling. It's grueling at school to learn spelling, and this applies to some degree to English as well. But when you've learned it, you kind of also understand old language as well, because the written languages are so similar. So this is why we have letters in Icelandic, in modern Icelandic, that are not actually pronounced. So because they help us to understand old Icelandic. So knowing Icelandic, having Icelandic as a native language gives you access to the old literature to some degree. Of course, when you can't really read properly, this access dies, and there's a lot of complaints about people not being able to read literature anymore, and that applies both to medieval and modern literature.
And well beyond Iceland.
Yes, I think this is a universal issue, and the computers are to blame. They have given us a lot. Without them, we would not be speaking, but they also take something from us.
They give and they take away.
Yes.
All right. Ranveig had asked, do you have any advice on how to read about literature when I have a science background? I have a hard time understanding what the method is, and sometimes feel like people are just picking things out of the air. Obviously, I find some arguments more convincing than others, but if my education taught me one thing, it's that what I find convincing is not always a good indicator for if something is true.
Yes, yeah, I understand the issue. I have one of my doctoral students that has graduated, had an undergraduate degree in maths, and that proved to be no impediment whatsoever for saga studies. So I think it's very possible to make this transition. The method, well, there's a variety of method in literary research, obviously. And obviously there are also flawed and illogical arguments in literary studies, but that doesn't mean that literary studies as such are not scientific. Like I regard them as we don't use in English science for the humanities, but I see them as the same kind of. You have to have discipline, you have to have method, and then you also have, of course, differences of opinion, and so there's a variety of method, but mostly the method we used are just the old-fashioned close reading methods, which is you have a text and you interpret it based, of course, on your familiarity with the environment, which is, I think, what is most important for 13th, 14th century literature, is knowing all the things that are different between then and now. And then, of course, there's the understanding of the language. And language, language is so important for literature. Literature happens in language. So that is, of course, the most important thing, to understand Icelandic. And nobody really understands Icelandic 100%. Even linguists that are familiar with Icelandic from all the ages, they sometimes come across words that they don't understand. And there are words, particularly in the Eddic poetry that you have translated, and that nobody really knows what they mean. There's just this word that appears in this one place, and then you have to find out what it could possibly mean using context and etymology, etc. So I would say literary studies have a mixed bag of methods, which is what makes them fascinating. There's not one method to master, there's several. And I think, like in contemporary literary studies, it is taken as given that people do have a grasp on the method, which they may not necessarily always have, but it's taken as a given. And what is interesting is your attitude, like what sort of theory do you subscribe to? Like, is your interest in class, gender, all these issues? What are the issues you're reading the sagas for? So that is often more prominent when you read modern saga studies, is what exactly is the scholar looking for in this text. So I would say this is a great shift in saga studies for the last 50, 60 years. There's no unity of interpretation.
Excellent. All right, let's see. Carl Nielsen had asked, do the medieval texts inform or influence contemporary literature? What Icelandic contemporary writers and translation should we check out in addition to your own?
Yeah, they do. Like, there are so many. I think I wrote an article about this recently in Scandinavian Canadian studies. And that's mostly concerns the last 10, 15 years. So people, Icelandic authors and Scandinavian authors and authors all over the world are still using the medieval Norse Icelandic literature as a kind of a quarry. They go into it. Everyone knows the TV show The Vikings. Is it Vikings or The Vikings? But you know the show, very popular. And so that's an adaptation, modern adaptation of medieval literature, and you have them everywhere. So I would say that the Old Norse literature are among the most popular historical literary genres for modern adaptations. And of course, they are kind of they pervade modern literature as well, because in the early 20th century, the sagas were something everyone had read, so they had influence. They had a lot of impact on Icelandic literature. Of course, they also have impact on learned literature from other countries. So you see them everywhere. And of course, what is most influential is Old Norse mythology. And that is, in a way, far bigger than Iceland. You know, its influence is everywhere. And it's seen as a common Germanic heritage or Scandinavian Germanic heritage. And so that's like a really big part of modern culture, I would say, like especially, of course, in Northern Europe, but also the US and Canada, just because these are immigrant countries from Europe, so or partly, so it's like, so there's a lot of influences and there's a lot of impact and influences.
And in the realm of contemporary Icelandic writers, are there any you might recommend in particular who draw on that tradition?
Well, I myself do it, so obviously I would recommend myself, but it's like I have 2 novels that are partly based on medieval literature. There's Einar Kárason, who's been hugely popular, and there's Vilborg Davíðsdóttir, also hugely popular. I don't know the state of translations for all these authors, but it is quite, there's Gerður Kristný, who's used the mythology in particular. So there's a lot of authors, and some are translated. So I think this is quite a big area to enter into. So, and of course there's Tolkien. You know, just to name one author that quite many people have read. He is working he's using sagas and mythology in his books, and so are several other English, German, and even Borges, Spanish authors. Yeah.
Right, and many people are influenced through Tolkien without even knowing all the elements that come from Icelandic literature.
Yes, and he also is a part of a tradition of using Old Norse medieval literature in his own work. He's not the first to do it. He is the most successful, but he is in a way like a part of a greater tradition.
Friðrikur Bjarnason wanted to know what your opinion is on the theory that the Icelandic settlers were already a separate group from the Norwegians before they left Norway.
I don't really have an opinion about this. It's a very interesting idea, and quite many scholars and people think this, but I haven't looked into the matter really, so I'm not sure if it's true or not. Like, it's not really something that interests me. Like, I am one of the wave of scholars that are less interested in origins than the 13th, 14th century reality. So that's what I usually deal with, like the texts themselves and their reality rather than the origins. So whether Icelanders were already a separate group in Norway, I think that's quite possible, and many people believe it, but I have no opinion. Like, there was the famous Herul theory that Icelanders are on. Do you say Herul? There was an Icelandic scholar who believed that Icelanders were an Indo-European tribe that had
Oh,
Norway,
I know what you're talking about.
and then they like en masse went to Iceland, and you know it's impossible to prove. I don't know.
Right.
The genetics don't think they help very much with this.
I think that's the Heruli idea, yeah. But this is, if I may say, one of the things that I really respect about your approach, and something that I've honestly tried to emulate from your approach, is to say we are justified in talking about the text we have, not in, and we lose our right to talk about it as we try to reconstruct something else from it. You know, we have these.
I'm not huge on speculating. Like, I know many people are speculators when it comes to Old Norse, but I possibly like the person who comes from the natural sciences. I feel there is so much we have in our hands, all the texts that we have. So in a way, I am more interested in dealing with that than using them to get to some other place.
Einar Birgir Kristjansson asked, how did the poems of Egill Skallagrímsson survive until they were written down in the Roman alphabet? Did Snorri write Egil Saga and compose the poems?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question because, and there's no agreement about this. Egil Saga has a lot of poems. They seem to be treated as separate from the saga itself. The preservation history is slightly different than the preservation history for the prose. Many people have believed that the author of Egil Saga, whoever he was, maybe it was Snorri Sturluson, but maybe it was somebody else, composed the poems. Others see them as traditional, but the question is, if they're traditional, are they from Egil themselves, or are they from the 12th century or the 11th century? I think that it's very unlikely that all the poems in the saga are actually from Egil himself. Some might be, and I think with tradition spanning almost 300 years, there's bound to be development. It's like the poems are going to evolve. There's going to be more poems ascribed to him. The poems themselves might even change. We don't really know how they were preserved before they were written down. Possibly there was some method of writing, but I think most scholars believe they were just preserved in memory, orally. But that, of course, means that they are more likely to, they're more fragile when it comes to transformation. So they're likely to have changed. And so I think it's, Egil Skallagrímsson is an interesting case because there was probably somebody who was named Egil Skallagrímsson and lived in the 10th century at the place where he's said to live. But then we have a character called Egil that has very distinct qualities in the saga. And when we say Skallagrimsson existed, do we mean Egil, a person called Egil, or do we mean Egil precisely as he is in the saga? And this is not the same answer. So I usually ask my student if they say, I believe Egil existed. I do too, but which Egil? Was he exactly like in the saga, or was he completely different? Like, what happened to this character in these 300 years? And the poems, including the poems. But I think it's quite likely that he did exist and was a poet. But whether he wrote all the poetry in the saga, I'm not sure. I think it's quite unlikely that he wrote absolutely everything. But he could have written some of them, definitely. And they could be from his time, even if not composed from him, by him.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. That's the best answer I could conceive for that. Here's an interesting one, a little bit more of a subjective question from Hamish. I hope I'm saying that right. What's the most beautifully written saga, not visually speaking, most beautifully written saga in both of your opinions? So I'll let you go first.
Well, I recently read the Saga on the radio in Iceland, and you can actually find this on Spotify and some other podcast sites. So I have a particular affinity for that particular saga, and I really enjoyed when you read an entire saga on the radio, you grow fond of it. And it is really well written, and I've also tried to read in French, and the Icelandic style is very economical. Like it's really, it uses as few words as possible to create a lot of meaning. So I think it's a really well-composed saga. There are other really well-composed sagas that I like. Gizlazara was not a favorite of mine when I was a teenager. There is a film that you might have seen that's, like people, there are mixed opinions about how well it has aged. It was not...
The Outlaw.
It did not have a huge budget. That is kind of obvious. I think there are the same 10 extras are used for everything, and it kind of shows. But it's still a very interesting adaptation, I think. And Gizlazara, when I taught it, I found it extremely subtle. So I think I would have to mention that too. Eyrbyggja Saga and Laxdæla Saga are also favorites of mine. Beautiful. I don't know, we're entering like German 18th, 19th century philosophy here. Like, what is beautiful? I think they are beautiful, all of them, in a way. But obviously some authors are more competent than others. I also like some of the less well-written sagas, like Morkinskinna, which I did my doctoral dissertation about. I am absolutely enamored with this saga, but it's not as well written as Njál Saga, because it's not as, like, it doesn't use the words quite as well. But it's really it fascinates me. Sometimes, like, it's like romance. People fall in love with people without these people not necessarily being the most beautiful people on earth, but they have a kind of fascination for you. And Morkinskinna has that for me.
I understand what you mean. For my answer, I'll be brief, but I'll start backwards. I do think some sagas are not beautifully written, perhaps, in terms of just pure aesthetic joy of reading. The one that I think of in that respect is actually one I just published a translation of, Foresight Saga. I actually don't love how it's written in Icelandic. But one that I do like, for sure, is Egil Saga Skallagrimssonar. I actually think that and that's beyond just the poetry, which I really like. I think that the prose is an excellent example of the kind of economical style that you're talking about. And it does keep me going. It does engage me somehow, just the writing itself. So that would be my vote. All right, let's see. Blake Winter asked, how literally did the Icelanders at the time of writing the sagas take the notions of trolls, ghosts, etc.? For a comparison, people today often tell ghost stories set in the past, but very few people really believe in them. In the same way, people would tell tall tales about Paul Bunyan. They're just fun stories. So, did the Icelanders really believe that, say, a ghost seal showed up in a pantry, like an Ármann saga, or that Ingjald's snout had a nose an ell long?
Well, I think we need to begin with the Newtonian revolution here, like the scientific mindset that emerges in the 17th and 18th century kind of dominates today. And that is the idea that natural sciences can be used to evaluate what is real and what is unreal. And of course, this can change a lot. You know, we were all like prisoners of a virus earlier recently, and people had no ideas about viruses in the time of the sagas. So if you had tried to describe a virus to a medieval person, you would sound mad, wouldn't you? Like invisible things that make you sick. But of course they did have some idea of how sicknesses were transmitted nevertheless. So it's so we have to like try to get rid of the scientific mindset. So like when they saw a ghost, did they see anything? That is the question. And is the ghost real? If you see it, whether it is there or not, that is another question. So I think you should focus on the sightings. And I think people obviously saw something. And of course they didn't have like my glasses. So they were possibly more likely to see things that were not necessarily trolls, but were still there. So I think that there's not the kind of skepticism that we have today, where we think we know what is real and not. I think there's more openness about things being possibly real, but not necessarily. And of course, what I have been talking about in my work is what do they mean when they use the word like a troll? Like my idea is that it's a quite undefined word, so it doesn't necessarily mean a particular kind of being. And you know, ghosts, people still saw them in the 20th century. Like mediums were quite popular in Iceland in the early 20th century, even with the ruling classes. And then they became slightly plebeian, and people began to see space UFOs. Haven't they dropped UFO sightings? I find UFO sightings fascinating because when I was a kid, everyone saw UFOs and people were always being abducted by aliens. And then the aliens lost interest in abducting humans at some point. I guess it's Twitter. They discovered how boring humans are on Twitter and stopped abducting them. But my point is that, you know, the paranormal is always changing and it always exists. People always believe ridiculous things, you know, fake news, and the paranormal is always there. It just changes. Like people believe different things in different times. So I think, you know, I've met people who saw ghosts. I once met a 109-year-old lady in Iceland. She was the oldest Icelander at the time. And she began to talk to me about ghosts she had seen in 1914. And this was thrilling. You know, I was thrilled by this. And she realized it. I don't think she realized why I was thrilled. Because, you know, the world she was born into and my scholarly interests are quite different. But I found it thrilling to meet a person who had seen all these ghosts and was interested in talking about it and was traumatized by people laughing at her because, of course, in the early 20th century, we would have seen a duel between the scientific mindset and the folkloristic mindset going on. Yeah, and of course, seeing ghosts is very, it's linked with personal trauma. And this is what people have been doing my aunt died this year, and she had promised me in one of our last phone calls to return as a ghost. She may have been joking. I have no idea. She was always slightly interested in the paranormal. So this is one of my last memories of her threat to return as a ghost. And then actually her husband phoned me using her telephone. So I got that on the telephone it says aunt. And she was dead and had made this threat. But then it was her husband using the phone. It was not a paranormal experience.
Well, still, it primes you for it.
Yeah, this year, this is a story from this year.
Well, my mom sees ghosts, so I mean, at the risk of being too, it's not a completely gone belief.
No. It's just endlessly changing what people see.
Right. On the subject of your own literary work, Cameron Crunkleton wanted to ask, where did you get the motivation for The Curse of Horemheb?
Oh, yes. That actually came to me in a dream. I had this dream about a mother and daughter who lived in a museum, and there was blood on the walls, and it was a curse they connect with mummy. But I think it's actually, this is how it came to me directly, but indirectly, obviously it's because I grew up reading mummy stories about like Tutankhamun and all these Egyptian ghosts. So like my work comes from culture. I'm not ashamed of being a professor. So I use that in my work. Like I just write, I use my education a lot in my work. And a lot of, I think novels are good for theorizing. Like you can think things out in scholarly text, but you can also think them out in poetry and scholarship. And they are kind of rewarding. Like you can do thought experiments in fiction as well as in scholarship. So I think that's something I enjoy doing. But this is a book only.
I respect that.
Now, sadly, but maybe later.
Yeah, I'm kind of inspired by your literary endeavors. I haven't tried it myself really, and I like it. It seems like fun.
Well, you're well known in Iceland for having adopted Star Wars to Saga style. So
I've heard that is somewhat well known, that unjustly. All right, Sharon Duberg asked if you could tell us something about the truth that is known regarding Eric the Red. Perhaps you could.
Yeah, he's actually a quite ancient figure. Like he is mentioned in Ari's Icelandic book that we believe is written in the 1120s, and I don't want to go into the arguments for that, but it's quite convincing, although the manuscript is only from the 17th century. And so this is in 1120, and Eiríkur is alive in 980, then he finds Greenland. So, and this is clearly seen as a very important event in Icelandic book, which is a really brief narrative. It's only 10 chapters, and it's very easy to read. You can read it swiftly, and it's very much a synopsis of Icelandic history. But Eiríkur's discovery is seen as important enough to mention. So I think it's very likely that he did exist and had this name and settled Greenland. So it's close to the. There's a unusually small gap between the actual event and the first sources, but it's still 140 years. This is something we have to deal with old Icelandic history, that writing only begins in the 12th century, and everything is kind of a late source, like King Arthur and other historical figures, I guess. So Eiríkur is quite well known. I don't think Ari says a lot about him. So I think like he's hugely popular, because we were discussing modern adaptations earlier. he's hugely popular with modern novelists, fiction writers. I think I first encountered him in Tintin. No, in Asterix. In Asterix, there was an Eiríkur the Red in one of the Asterix books. So he is extremely popular. They of course have to invent the character for him because he's not a very clear character in Icelandic book. Then we have the much younger Eirik Saga Rauða, which has a more detailed narrative of him, but that's from the late 14th century.
Right, and is a little bit opinionated about his family, it seems.
Yes, it's Leifur Eiríksson. I was telling somebody yesterday that Leifur Eiríksson is not as well known in Iceland as he is in America. Like there's a very nice statue of him in front of the Hallgrímur Church, which is Reykjavik's best-known landmark, and many Icelanders don't know who he is. They say it's Ingvar Ármannsson or something. So Leifur somehow doesn't figure very strongly in the modern Icelandic imagination, and that's of course like changing views about finding continents that were already found, but also like, I don't know, maybe it's just the Icelandic-American connection is slightly weaker than it was 50, 90 years ago.
That might be true. And actually, by the way, about Leifur Eiríksson, one of the strangest things to me is that on Amazon.com, any anonymous work of Old Icelandic literature is attributed to Leifur Eiríksson. That is the author given for the Sagas of Icelanders and the Poetic Edda and all this, and I don't know why.
No, we don't know that he wrote
some bizarre.
I think
no, he certainly didn't write Egil Saga. You know, like why is that?
I think the statue of him is actually by an American sculptor. So it's not.
I think so. Well, he is becoming very well known over here. Okay, so those are the questions that were submitted, or I did one for every person. Are you doing all right for time? Can I go back and give you more questions that were submitted before, or do you want to take some spontaneous ones? What do you feel like?
No, you can just give me more questions. It's like my computer isn't crashing yet, so that's the time we have.
Okay. Well, Marcel and Sarah had also asked if you think that Njál Saga is written by a man or a woman.
Yeah, well, it's anonymous, obviously, and I think, you know, it is one of my favorite sagas, and it's very hard to gender great literature like that. You know, it's clearly, I think the author is clearly such a unique character, a unique personality, that you can't see them as typically male or female. I think statistically all the sagas are more likely to be written by males because of, if we look at other authors of the period, they are anonymous, which might suggest women had a hand in them too, because anonymous literature is, you know, possibly it's anonymous because they were written by women. There are certainly women mentioned in connection with literature in early Iceland, and it's interesting that, in particular, Ari the Learned, he traces his line from a female settler. He mentions a woman as one of his main sources, and he is also like the grandson of Guðrún, also the great grandson, I think, of Guðrún Ósvífursdóttir, who is the heroine of Laxdæla Saga. So there's a lot of women involved in Ari's emergence, and the same applies to Bishop Thorlákur. His mother is said to have taught him like mannfræði, which probably means genealogy, and Sturla Þórðarson, 13th century historian, was also raised by a woman, and my brother is of the opinion that Snorri was not the author of Egil Saga, but maybe his sister was, because his sister named her son Egil, whereas Snorri named none of his sons Egil, but instead used ridiculous names for both of them. So he says, who is the real fan of Egil in this family? And so this is all possible. So I think female saga writers are quite possible, but it's hard to gender the authors, definitely, because the authors would be like so clever, that you can't find out which gender they are. But I think women clearly have a role in heritage in Iceland, so they're not unlikely. As scholars remarked 40, 50 years ago, they had a huge role in the preservation of honor in the sagas, which may be fictional. Like, this is something that may be fictional, but the saga authors clearly believe that women are the guardians of honor, and that is a role that could include writing about, like, your ancestors' exploits. So it's not impossible; it's impossible to prove. So it's like hard to say, but I wouldn't exclude it. Most 20th century scholars believed that the authors were male, but maybe that's more telling about them and their society than about the saga age. So it's hard to know.
I think it's all well stated. All right, Ranveig had asked, what exactly distinguishes sagas from other literature? Is it mostly just tied to the period and locality, or are there clear thematic or stylistic characteristics?
Yeah, this relates to what I said in the beginning, that the saga is an Icelandic word for story, and it's used for almost all prose literature. So saga in this sense is not really a genre. It just means a prose narrative. What's usually called the saga is literature from Iceland depicting distant history. And you can see generic traits there, like there are stylistic similarities, there are structural similarities, but it's not very simple. It is, the way it's used today, it means a work dealing with history. And it's supposed to be real, and it tells of your ancestors. So that's the typical saga. This genre exists only in Iceland, really. But of course, we have quite similar narratives from other medieval cultures. But the convention is to, when you say saga, you mean Icelandic literature from the 13th and 14th and perhaps even the 15th century that is relating the earliest centuries of Iceland.
Right. All right. And another question from Friðrikur Bjarnason,
yes,
who wants to know, what is your favorite tuku-orð, or what tuku-orð do you want to express hatred of?
I'm not sure. Like, there are so many of them in Icelandic. One of them is bíll, that just means car, and this is automobile, and the Germans took another part of this word into their language, and it's a nice word that you use every day because there are a lot of cars in Iceland. We also have like words like biskup for bishop, etc. So Iceland is replete with them. I think, like everyone else, I sometimes detest new loanwords, like when people start using new loanwords. But I think, like, once a word is a loanword, it's kind of assimilated into the Icelandic language, whereas sometimes people are just speaking English, like they switch between Icelandic and English, or use English words because they don't remember the Icelandic word. And that's something I dislike, but not loanwords as such. I kind of like them. There's one loanword that is pizza, and my generation, people born my year, I think the shift is in 1972. Like people born 1972 and earlier say pizza, whereas people born later say pizza with a different vowel. So this is something you come across, and the difference is so slight that people don't really notice it, and thus do not change the way they speak. But so Icelanders have two ways of like describing this dish.
Huh.
That only appeared in
surprising.
Iceland in my lifetime. Like when I was like 9 before I had my first pizza. So it's a new thing in Iceland.
I wouldn't have known that either.
No.
I saw quite a bit of it in Reykjavik.
Yes. It's now.
All right. Were more questions that were submitted beforehand. I have seen a couple spontaneous questions. Would you take a couple of these?
Yeah, just pick any questions you like.
Okay. I see that Linda Sexton asked, was the book Paranormal Encounters simply a natural evolution of your interest in trolls, etc.? Or was there another factor more recently that made it especially relevant today?
Yeah, the Paranormal Encounters is like an anthology, and it emerges from a group project. We had a grant. We had a 3-year grant from the Icelandic Research Fund. And we did not promise to make an anthology, but somehow the group wanted to. So it's like, I think it's about 20 people who write in it. And they all have at some point been at the University of Iceland, even if it's not just for a term. And we used the word paranormal in our project precisely because it's not like the usual word for the Middle Ages. So we were trying to, I guess, goad the audience into seeing that there are similarities between the X-Files and medieval ghosts. So we were trying to like draw out similarities, and it's explained in the introduction that it's actually quite good word. So it very much comes from my research, but it's like a group project mostly, and I only have a very small article in it. Yes, exactly. There are 2 books, and I use Paranormal Activity in my troll book, which is a direct reference to the X-Files, as you will know. A great show that I didn't watch in its entirety, but it was quite inspiring in some way.
I remember it. I never made an effort to watch it when it was on the air, but I saw it sometimes. Yeah. I remember it being entertaining.
Yeah, and for people interested in folklore, there was a lot of folklore in it. And this is like modern folklore. True. It's very focused on aliens, or it was at some point. Maybe not so much in the 21st century.
Let's see, and Randberg had asked, did the rest of Scandinavia also write the same types of sagas around the same time?
There is some people believe that the sagas are a Norwegian Icelandic product, and the Norwegians have a hand in some of the sagas, but that's mostly the king sagas, I think. And some of them are Norwegian historiography. In Denmark, from Denmark and Sweden, we have almost nothing in the native language. The Danish historiography is in Latin mostly. So Iceland, somebody once told me, but I don't know how well they have checked it, that the Icelandic medieval heritage is the 2nd largest after French, like as languages. And I think it's well possible. Like, it's an enormous production for such a small island nation, although Iceland in a way was less small in the Middle Ages than it's now, because the population growth in Iceland was less than in other European nations between the 14th and the 20th century. So in a way, Iceland was closer to the other. It's now a very tiny nation when it comes to population, but it was much closer to the rest of Europe in the Middle Ages. So it's not quite as small.
I see what you mean.
But it's still like an enormous amount of preserved literature for a language used by so few. So this is like, in a way, the Icelandic claim to medieval fame is like all this stuff we have.
That's an interesting point about the proportionate population in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
Vicky asked, she wonders what you make of the use of sagas, saga heroes, saga-like exploits in contemporary Icelandic literature to comment on or critique modern social and political issues. She's thinking of Hattur Laxness Gerpla or Sion Skugabaldur.
Well, those are both really good novels, I think. And Gerpla, of course, caused quite a stir in Iceland in the middle of the 20th century because it was using Icelandic national heritage for a very strong satirical criticism of, I guess, power in general, but in some ways also medieval power. So it was a very controversial text in its time. It has a very interesting story. The language, I think Halldór Laxness was planning to use saga style, but owing to what I mentioned earlier about the language change in Iceland, the saga style is too close to 20th century prose style, so that he had to go to the 14th century for a more exotic feel. So he actually had to move closer in order to be more exotic. So it's an enormously important book. I think this exists in English as The Happy Warriors, which is, a title nobody likes, but it is kind of funny and interesting. Sjón's work is, I would, it's more 19th century culture that he's dealing with that. But of course, folklore and saga in the broader sense, like, I guess, somebody mentioned that he only used medieval vocabulary. I think he tried to, but I think that's less uncommon than you think. I think, like, when you're writing a historical work, it's often hard to use very modern terms. Yeah, wayward heroes is a new. So
and that actually ties in. I was just going to say, I'm sorry, we have a lag, but that is actually related to something that Ranveig had asked too, which is if you wrote a saga in 2021, would it still be a saga?
Yes, that is a very interesting question. And I recently wrote an article about Guðni Jónsson. Guðni Jónsson published 42 sagas in 12 years or so in the middle of the 20th century. And he included modern texts, which he felt were also sagas, even though they were modern. And I think he talks about it in his introduction and says the saga is not a dying form, it still exists. But this was really controversial. And the most common, scholars commonly use sagas only for medieval prose narratives. But this, of course, is a choice. Like all discussion of genre is in a way a categorization you're using yourself. Language is imposing restrictions on texts. So I think it's quite useful to just use it for medieval texts of a certain kind. But it has been used. Like, I think Star Wars has been called a saga, and we have the Foresight Saga by Nobel Prize-winning author John Goldsworthy, and this is like a novel that concerns like modern English family, And I think he uses the word saga mostly because he is dealing with several generations, which is done in most, but not all of the sagas. Like some of the sagas only deal with a single generation. So I think obviously the saga has been used for different texts, but I think it's useful to use them to confine yourself to something when you use it. Of course, the Icelandic does not help because it just means story. Like when you're at an AA meeting telling your story, it's your saga. You're telling. So everyone has a saga.
Right. The word does have a complex set of conflicting uses.
It is. It's not a good genre word. And I think it's still open to a debate whether the sagas are a genre or what sort of genre they are. So it's and I don't think we should assume genres too easily. In a way, they are very often modern constructions, and it's not certain that medieval people would have regarded them in that way, although they might have in the case of the family sagas.
It's an interesting point too. I mean, there's also a certain amount of perforation between the boundary of, say, the Fornaldarsögur and the Sagas of Icelanders, right? I think about how, there's kind of a continuum from something like Kettle Trout through Egil, where there's, like they both share aspects of one another in terms of, even the places they talk about and writing style and characterization techniques and such.
And the Fornaldarsögur are invented in 1829 as a name for an edition. And the whole category is invented in that year by a Danish colonel who is publishing the sagas. So it's not like an authentic medieval genre. And I think like when you speak of genre, you're speaking of either the categorization that you use or possibly audience reception in the Middle Ages. And I think audience reception is very, very like, I think we should pay more attention to that when we're talking about genre, because like with modern genres such as fantasy and detective stories, audience expectation is everything. And this is probably also true of the Middle Ages. What did the audience expect to hear when somebody was beginning a saga? So is it a genre or isn't it a genre? I think we need to I think this needs to be discussed further. I think people have lazily assumed that categories invented for the purpose of making an edition, making 19th, 20th century editions are authentic genres.
Well, this is a really good point. We can develop this further right now if you want. I'm interested in your thoughts about this. I think the audience is too. Where do you come down here? Do you feel like there's a boundary to be laid between some of these subgenres, like between, say, the Íslendingasögur and the Fornaldarsögur, or the Riddarasögur, or do you think those just aren't useful terms?
Well, like the Poetic Edda, we have a manuscript from the Middle Ages that groups all these texts together. So we can indeed say it's a genre because they have a special look and there is medieval evidence for them being categorized together. With the Fornaldarsögur, I think they are very different. Some of them are traditional, some of them are quite untraditional. What unifies them is when and where they take place. And does that make a genre? Some people say they use like Bakhtinian concepts to argue that it does, but I'm not quite sure about it. I think it's possible that you could have genres, and Marianne Kalinke famously identified the bridal quest genre, which was both Fornaldarsögur and Riddarasögur. And I think it's and you could say, are the Icelandic tragedy or comedy at least one of them is clearly a comedy because it ends in 3 marriages. You know, if you end in 3 marriages, it's a comedy. You know, it's not a tragedy. You know, tragedies never end in 3 marriages. But where other sagas end in everyone being dead, so it's quite a different. Hrafnkell Saga, Egil Saga, how alike are they? You know, one is a legal feud between 2 individuals that takes place in a couple of years, and the other one is a life story of an Icelandic poet. But what unites them is maybe similar style, but there's so much difference. You know, Hrafnkell Saga is really atypical for many of the Icelandic sagas, and yet it has been used so much to speak about the genre. So I'm kind of like in the article, which I think Stella has mentioned here on the sidelines, about the decline of realism. I'm kind of flirting with the idea that Hrafnkell Saga is from the 15th century, and this is why it's so different from the 13th century sagas, because the genre has changed. So that's one possibility. But I think, like, I would be very, you know, the question is, do we need genres? You know, what do we need them for? Just to put out editions, or are we talking about the like the audience? And the audience is often not mentioned in saga criticism, like, even though we know there was an audience. So this
well, and this makes me. I'm sorry for the interruption, because of the lag. But this puts me thinking about some of our other genre definitions and how valid they are. Because you mentioned perhaps when all the sagas are being defined by where and when they occur. I guess that's westerns too.
Yes.
Right. So is western a genre? Right.
Yeah. It's
I guess
genres, John Wayne films. You know, there is the same kind of setting. But that's perhaps the only similar thing. You know, and this is a Roy Rogers Western, same as a John Wayne Western. It's kind of, you know, they're not quite. Yes, exactly. Then there's the spaghetti Western. That's quite different. So it's maybe it's not a genre either. But in a way. But I think, like,
and I guess it. Go ahead.
I would say the important thing is knowing what a genre is for, and not just meaningless categorization, which is, you know, the scholarly world is full of meaningless categorization. You know, that's how scholarship started in the 18th century. You know, endless categorization of everything, but you know, maybe we should be slightly hesitant to just continue endlessly in that vein.
Well, and I mean, if we're really drinking a few pots of coffee each, you know, I think we get to the question of, is there genre? Right? Like what
exactly is it? Yeah.
Right. Are we talking about just, you know, some shared tropes? Are we talking about audience expectations? Or are we really, like you said, is it just an example of sort of early Enlightenment era categorization for the sake of categorization? Right.
Yeah, I think it's most useful when people use it to, like, analyze the saga. So, like, the Bridal Quest book was good because it analyzed the sagas, and it, you know, told you things about the sagas. But I think it would be like, and this is perhaps attracted to the person from the sciences who asked one of the earliest questions, is like, begin with the idea that you don't know, like that there is no genre, and then ask, do we need it? Like maybe like Descartes, you know, or Occam's razor, you know, do we need it if it didn't exist? Or are we just like channeling heritage?
Right. Because I think you can take, and this really hits at something that I think is important. You can sometimes take 2 sagas and say, these are very similar as literary monuments. So, for example, think of Bjarna Saga Hittala and Gunnar Saga Ormstungu.
Yes.
Right. I think, you have very similar characters, you have very similar structure, you have a lot of similar events. Like, there you can say if genre means anything, it's putting these two things together. But then, like you said, take Hrafnkel Saga and Egil Saga on the other hand, and how much are you really meaning when you say these are the same genre?
Yeah.
One is poetry, one is centered on poetry, the other has no poetry.
Yes.
Right.
Hardly any. Some are centered on love triangles, others don't really have any gender issues, and Grettir and Egil are a case in point because there are so many similarities between them, but there are also vast differences. So Grettir and Egil are in some way very similar, but in other ways they're quite dissimilar, and so are their sagas. These are not the same type of saga at all. Even with all the obvious similarities, like following the hero from the birth to the death, like we have like children episode in both sagas, which are not common in sagas. We don't know what Gunnar of Hlíðarenda was like as a child, or for example.
Right. Interesting point. That is, I hadn't thought about that as a really distinct feature of those two. And now I'm trying to think of other sagas that have child episodes. I guess Gunnlaugur, there's a childhood episode.
This is like, I have had all these perverse, interest in scholarship, and one of them is childhood and old age and teenagers, and it provides quite a good insight in what sagas are like, just exploring these different aspects of them, like, and seeing how unusual Egil is, for example, in being followed from his birth to extreme old age. This is not usual in a saga. It's the only pattern. It's a very interesting journey because he begins as infirm and picked upon, and then he ends as infirm and picked upon as well. It's a very interesting circle he goes through. And he only kills people in a child and an old man. This is something I noticed once, that all Egil's killings are abroad. He only kills, I think, 4 people in Iceland. As a child, like between the age of 13 and 18, he seems to kill nobody in Iceland. So this is interesting. Like,
I have never thought of that, and that is a fascinating observation.
Yeah, this in a way proves how clever he is, because some people will not admit Egil is clever, but he is, and he knows none of the killings after the first one will have any consequences for him in Iceland. He knows better. Like, it's either his own slaves or his father's servant he kills, so he can't be killed in return for these killings, and he knows it. He does the practical thing.
Right. That is such a fascinating story. I would tell students before teaching it that it's the tale of a terrible man and his successful career.
Yes. Whereas Grettir sometimes seems much nicer, but everything he does has dire consequences for him. He's
Well,
all his actions.
And this is a great subject we're riffing on here. I hope I'm not shoving too many people's questions out of the way, but I think that it's an interesting thing to follow up on a little bit, because this also connects back to something that was asked about before, as far as enjoying the reading of a given saga. To me, there's a huge difference between the reading experience of reading Egil Saga and reading Grettis Saga. I like reading most of the sagas. I have never really liked Grettis Saga, I will confess. Like, something about it just doesn't work for me.
I think it's weird. I think it's weird when you approach it from the 13th century saga logic. It doesn't really fit in. I think it's possibly a young saga as well. And as everyone knows, the 15th century was extremely weird, and it produced a lot of weird literature. It produced the longest Arthurian narratives, if I remember correctly, and they're quite different from the other Arthurian narratives. And everyone had strange haircuts, if you remember. So they have like 15th century is distinct, and I think it's a possible explanation for why some of the sagas seem so weird, because they're written in a kind of different culture.
And Saga Kaka too.
Yes, that could also
right.
be the 15th century, but that could also like be garbled, like some of the sagas that are not good, like Bjarnasar Hítalakappa, that has very few fans, and it's it's also like its preservation is a bit unsure. We don't really know if we have it, like if the original saga really exists. So sometimes it's hard to make judgment values about these sagas, because do we have the original or not? And this
so Stella was,
yes.
If I may, Stella was contributing something here and said, speaking to you, your main current novel series is a crime series. And my favorite article by you was The Fearless Vampire Killers, in part because that was a character trope I hadn't really thought about. So I was wondering if you saw any of that, and maybe more broadly, the horror influence of the sagas in modern lit or other works.
Yeah, I think it is. It's a good question. I can't deal with it easily, but it's like crime and the sagas. Famously, Gizlazara has been used as a medieval crime novel, but it's actually only one version of Gizlazara that has any ambiguity about who the killer is. And this is possibly age-related as well. Like 1 century knew who Viestid's killer is, the next one decides that it's ambiguous, and the third one decides they know. And so we have this strange one version which hides the fact who Viestid's killer is. And this is like a whodunit, I guess. But we also have like crime novels as a genre. It's not really a genre. It's a variety of genres. There's the procedural, there's the like Dashiell Hammett detective story, and there's the whodunit, and there are also several. There's the horror version. There are so many versions of crime novels, and always talk like they're the same thing. So I find crime fiction a very useful genre to make experiments in. So I think of my crime novels as experimental, but at the same time they're not obviously experimental, because then nobody would buy them. People want some reassurance when they buy crime novels. So I think it's only on second reading that people will realize that they're experimental, and they're actually not that very similar as literature, because I'm always trying to like move into different regions with them. But I'm also, if I can self-promote even more, I'm also putting out an elf series, like a series about Icelanders' attitudes to elves. So there's going to be an elf series next month, 4 books that I'm putting out. So that would be
awesome.
That would be another case of me using literature to think about stuff I also researched.
And what is the title?
The first one is called The Brother, but we decided to call the whole series Alfheimar, which is kind of interesting because it's also the name of the street I grew up in. So I actually grew up in Elfland. So it's just a Reykjavik street name. So yeah, sadly, I'm always trying to get somebody to translate them. So if you know of people interested, just contact me. I would be happy for them to be translated, but I think there is a translation project going on with the crime series, and the first elf book is currently being translated into German, but publication is uncertain at this point. But it's hard. Wow. Icelandic authors are not translated much as a rule, but so it's.
Well, and translation is a long process that really is a full-time job if you get into it. Well, that's awesome. And I think that the relationship with the elves and hidden folk stories are so interesting because very often when I mention Norse mythology today, one of the first things I hear, obviously Odin, Thor, Loki are going to come up quick in that conversation, but people hit Huldafolk really fast now. That's become a very top item in people's minds, which it really isn't there in the Eddas, or if it is, it's very vague, and so this has become. I don't know exactly where all this public awareness of that came from. And you go to Iceland, and there's all the elf tours and the ghost tours and such. Most Icelanders I know are pretty dismissive of it. I don't know about you and people of your acquaintance, but I find that a lot of people are just sort of cynical about it, and I don't meet a lot of people that really are, I guess, elf believers.
No, I think it's because of all the mythologizing. Like there's been some kind of tourist mythologizing of Icelanders as elf believers. So I think there's current reaction against that. Like Icelanders used to tell foreigners that everyone believed in elves just to be interesting. Like, it's the interesting, we are just like everyone else is not an interesting answer. Like, we are a quaint elf-loving nation. It's far more interesting and, brings people to Iceland. But really, Icelanders are just like all other Western countries. It's exactly the same types doing exactly the same thing. But, why would people come if they know that? So, having elf lore is useful for promotion. But there's also a reaction against it. It's become like a bit stale. This is endless talk. But also the elf is it's a constantly changing concept, and I do not think it means the same thing in medieval Icelandic as it does in 19th century Icelandic, and it's changed even further. It's been kind of appropriated by New Age religions, and the elves have shrunk, and this is normal. I think like paranormal figures tend to shrink as the humans grow. I think humans are always growing in their own estimation, and thus all other paranormal creatures shrink. So elves and Tinkerbell has had an influence, of course. So the elves are now currently reciting in flowers and stones, but in the 19th century they were the same size as us, and this is the period that I take as my yardstick for in my elf books. It's like what I'm trying to, even if the novels take place in the 21st century, what I'm trying to work out is why people liked elves in the 19th century. But they often use the word Hultefolk. So it's kind of the same thing. I think Jón Ármannsson says that Hultefolk dislike being called elves, that they feel it's derogatory. We have no idea how widespread this notion is. So it's like,
thank you. By the way, secondarily, I do thank you for stepping down from your mysterious elfin language and consenting to speak with us in our pedestrian, everyday 21st century English. This is something you and I talked about this maybe a few days ago. The strange expectations people have that actually can sort of weirdly connect Icelanders on the whole to these notions about elves, right? How many times do I post something that contains anyone speaking Icelandic or Old Norse, and there's some comment like this, I feel like I'm listening to elves or something like that. It's strange how it's gotten bundled up in that.
I'm hoping it will be beneficial for a novel series. That all this interest
I hope so too.
And in people buying my books. But who
I hope
knows?
so too.
It's a very I know in Germany Icelandic elves are really popular, and also in English-speaking countries. And
yes,
there's a magic, like this idea of a distinct community of people who are basically just like us, only bigger and better. I think it's an attractive idea.
Yeah, for sure. And I see Megan Nelson asking here whether elf is as loosely defined as troll. That was a big part of our first discussion, our first crowdcast. Do you want to touch on that briefly here too?
Well, troll is more, it's used much more in medieval Icelandic. So it's easier to say things about it because we have more cases. But elf, I think it is a very broad term in medieval Icelandic, like troll. So it can mean a variety of things too. It's possibly even broader. And then it becomes a specific otherworldly race in the 19th century. But then we have the influence of, the expansion of the natural sciences to being our main yardstick for our worldview. Like our worldview is dominated now by the natural sciences, and medieval worldview wasn't in the same way. So it's a completely different era we live in. So in terms of worldviews, and you can see this obviously this in both centuries. There's also the human experience, and that's a different. Like the human experience always affect your worldview too, and maybe they are more similar. Like humans are more or less the same. They're much richer, and our life is much easier. But it's still we are the same type of creature that wrote the Sagas. So,
right.
That of course.
Well, and with the same desire for mystery and intrigue.
Yes, indeed. So this is like, this is why the sagas keep being popular. One article I wrote was about the myths, the idea that they have always been popular in Iceland, which I don't think it's true. I think they were resurrected in the late 19th century. And that evolved into this myth that the early 20th century Icelander becomes like the representative of all Icelanders in time. So people will say, when arguing about Njálsá, they will say, my grandmother believes this, as if their grandmother is closer to Njálsá than we are. And of course he is, but only very slightly,
Right.
Our grandparents are 13 Icelanders. But this is a very common social myth in Iceland that somehow... Yes.
That's very interesting that you say that, because when I was in graduate school, one of the things I would do for some extra money was translate funeral books for Icelandic American families who had these old books that were made, in the 1700s, early 1800s in Iceland to commemorate fallen relatives. And I remember being struck at how different that Icelandic in style and language was so much more different from the sagas than 20th or 21st century Icelandic. Everybody had a biblical name, right? Everybody's Jón or Pétur, right? There's no references to the sagas ever, but there's tons of biblical references, and a lot more Danish spelling and more Danish loan words and such. So clearly there was something of a deliberate renaissance.
Yeah. I think you can even describe Iceland, the culture, as a resurrected medieval culture to a degree, at the place of the sagas in particular. I've asked my friends who are interested in 19th century letters to look for references to Icelandic sagas like Gunnar and Egill, and there are few. They're not as ubiquitous as they became in 20th century Icelandic culture. So in a way, there was just one generation of Icelanders who grew up reading the sagas as children's books, and that's people born from 1880 to 1910 perhaps. But later Icelanders have imagined that these represent all of historical Iceland. So
right.
This is like a modern myth.
That's interesting.
Yeah, interesting as the medieval myths.
So Guthbrandur Vigfusson, I kind of think about as a little bit of a pusher of this myth.
Yes.
Right.
Possibly.
You read the. Go ahead.
It's very political. Like, Iceland was essentially resurrected in the 19th century as an independent nation. And the medieval culture was such an essential part of it. And it was, it became the yardstick for, and of course it's understandable why, because medieval Iceland has greatness that, like, the rest of Icelandic history doesn't really have. The Iceland of the early 19th century was very average, apart from being extremely poor. So it was like not significant in any way. So we had this great tradition, the medieval tradition, and that became such an integral part of the creation of modern Iceland. So, and people, I think, like, most of the myths I've been talking about here, you will go to Iceland and someone will begin to tell you everything I've just denounced as a fact. They're still very current. People will say Icelandic has changed for 700 years. But oh yes, it has. And it has partly been changed.
I get that so often that it has just become a reflex to me to always say, look, I know this doesn't sound like modern Icelandic when I'm reading this in reconstructed pronunciation. I know what modern Icelandic sounds like, right? Yeah. I just always do this disclaimer about it because there'll always be someone.
I've only once attended a lecture by Noam Chomsky, and he was asked a question by an audience member who was describing exactly the theories he was refuting 50 years ago, and his response was, that is certainly a common conception, or something of that. This is something I would like to say to a lot of people. What people ask me about Icelandic myths, that is basically things Icelanders believe about the past, but are not necessarily true.
Well, we all have. I mean, you can find examples of this anywhere, right? But it's interesting to me how much this particular idea has also spread beyond Iceland. And look, this is not, for the record, we have an Icelandic guy and a guy who was interested enough in this to also get a PhD in it. We're not bashing Iceland or Icelanders. It's very interesting.
Scholars are just searching for the truth, and that sometimes means that cultural myths have to be addressed.
Absolutely. Well, all that well stated. This has been a great hour-and-a-half discussion. Would you consider taking a medieval mythology question at the end here that I see posed?
Obviously, yes. I don't.
Okay.
Can you read it to me?
Yes. Blake asks, is there a parallel between Odin and his brothers killing Emir and the Greek story of Zeus and his brothers killing Kronos? Do you have any thoughts on that?
You're opening a Pandora's box here, and that's, of course,
as it were,
bigger question. How much is Old Norse mythology influenced by both Christian but also Greco-Roman mythology? And I think it's quite likely that there is a lot of influence. But there's also, of course, possible that there are, like, genealogical parallels from their both religions are Indo-European, so there might be like a mutual ancestor, but it could also be influence. And this pertains to the fact that Old Norse myth comes mostly from 13th century Iceland, and it's described from the outside by Christian authors, and we don't really know much about what Old Norse myth was actually like. So it's before these myths are described in the 13th century, there's 800 years at least of cohabitation between Christianity, Germanic mythology, and classical Greco-Roman mythology. So the influences are back and forth, I would assume, and which of course means how do we find the genuine Old Norse myth? And this is much harder than you might think. Like, what is genuine here? And this is of course something that people who study myths are always trying to like deliberate, like how can you find the true myth that is not influenced by outside factors? And as somebody is stating here below, the possibility of original Indo-European inheritance can never be discounted, because we know that there are possible like survivals, especially of myth, for a long time. But it's always possible that it is later influence, like learned Latin, Greek influence as well. So in a way, it's sometimes very hard to say, you know, which is it. And I have great empathy for people studying Old Norse myth who want to find the true myth, because it's so hard.
Well, and I think that maybe the place where this is most apparently a problem is in accounts of the actual religious practice, because
Yes.
medieval writers, whether they be Christian or Muslim or Jewish, tend to set, you know, the one true monotheistic religion against everything else that is all the same.
Yeah. It's,
right.
it's a very complicated issue, I think, and you know, in a way, yeah, it's hard to face how little we know about it. Obviously, there was Old Norse myth, and it had gods like Odin and Thor, but you know, what were they like? Are the 13th century descriptions of them to be trusted? So this is a huge issue. But it doesn't mean, I'm not saying that they're fabrications. It's just this uncertainty about what is original about them.
Well, and at what point does something new become real? Right.
Yeah.
Is it a real part of Norse myth if it's been there since the 800s? Right.
Well,
as if you could ever tell, but where does something that's borrowed or influenced from outside, where does that become? It's like a loan word, right? When is beat an Icelandic word?
It seems likely that the like old Scandinavian and Germanic religion was more diverse than it's presented to be, because of there was no unified structure trying to like unify it. Like we in Christianity, we have all these attempts to invent a single religion that has like government support. But of course, we know that before that there were like several types of Christianity, and we still have a lot of, you know, Christian lore that is not exactly from the Bible and our later myths, etc. So I think we'd have to assume more diversity, and that the pantheon presented in the Snorri is fabricated. You know, it's maybe there were quite different people that believed in these gods. Maybe nobody believed in all of them, and they have a varied structure. So I don't think it's logical to expect it to be so like the Greco-Roman religions. But that being said, I don't really know much about their origins. So possibly what we know about them is also, to a degree, younger than, or they have evolved. So.
Right. Well, and I don't know if your experience is like mine, but anytime that I talk about this, and I get these angry responses like, well, just tell us what the answer is. Just tell us what's real. It's like, the point is...
Well, paganism was resurrected in the 20th century, and that has a lot of impact. You know, modern paganists, they want the religion that suits their needs. So that will impact the way they look at old paganism. We are fortunate in Iceland in that I have found the Icelandic paganists very experimental, and ready to listen to scholars. So they're not very, orthodox. They have not. They keep an open mind about these things. So it's always a joy to speak to them. And there's not this anchor and that you sometimes say with other pagan cults.
I do experience some of it sometimes, but not. But you're right, not from Icelandic members of the Ásatúarfélagið.
But these are like, it's not a very like extreme religion in any way. But this is affecting how paganism is being discussed today. Like it has significance for people's actual beliefs in the 21st century, and that, of course, makes for the whole debate becomes less what you say. It becomes less scholarly. Like it's not just an academic interest. It has actual meaning for people who are now alive, and that is kind of a tricky situation for all scholars. And in a way, the good thing about being a medievalist is that you don't get angry authors writing to you about how you describe their work. My colleagues that deal with contemporary literature, they may get letters by angry authors, but I'm safe from that. But in the case of the pagan religion, it has a contemporary significance.
Right, and part of what I find happens is a little bit like problems of translation. People who don't know another language come to another language expecting that they can substitute one thing for another, right? The English word to, to, can be a preposition, it can be an infinitive marker, right? You go to Icelandic and you don't have the same word for both, but people want till to be both, right?
Yeah.
I think something similar happens with people approaching reconstructed paganism, where they come in with Christian ideas. There's commandments, there's blasphemy, there's holy days that work in a particular way, and they want to just superimpose something new on each of those categories, but the categories themselves are coming from somewhere outside.
It's kind of a dictionary fallacy. Like a dictionary is a very useful thing, but it says this word means this word, and it never really does. Right. The dictionary, even the best dictionary, is limited because it's attempting a thing that isn't really possible. So while dictionaries are really useful, they're not enough to describe the whole language. You have to know it like more organically from speaking it, etc. So you can't just take a dictionary and translate the whole sentence from it, because languages never work in that way.
Right, like, and religion likewise.
Nu, there's an Icelandic word nu, and sometimes translators assume it means anything, and it sometimes nu does mean something, but very often it means nothing. It's just interposed into sentences for no good reason. So I often see this with translation, that people really want to give much value to the word nu, and as an Icelandic speaker, my feeling is that it's just a word that means nothing. You've just put it in to get rhythm into the sentence. Right.
Well, or just hesitation words, hetna, right? It's almost like someone were trying to translate English.
Yeah, like, that was very popular.
Like kind of is another one that doesn't really. Yeah. And the thing is, it sort of undercuts this notion that language is immanently logical, because these things don't really mean anything, but it's almost unnatural not to use them.
Yes, and they are part of language, and they do mean something. Just, it's not easy to explain in a dictionary way.
Right. What do? You just say use sometimes in hesitation. I mean, I guess that's a definition, but it doesn't give you a translation exactly.
But the person who says like as every third word, you know what kind of character it is. It does provide character.
Well, and in a sense, in our language, here's another can of worms. But in a sense, in our language, we're always characterizing ourselves.
Yes.
So consciously or unconsciously.
Yeah, that's one of the things language does. It doesn't always have this strict scientific meaning.
Right. Well, that's an excellent, I think, concluding thought for us, because we're pushing up fairly close to our 2-hour deadline. Do you have some closing thoughts? You have a new history of literature coming, don't you?
Yes. This is like a collaborative project because we have a 5-volume history of Icelandic literature, but the students cannot read it all. And so they're complaining, and we're trying to make a book that's more accessible to students now. They can actually read, and which fits with the way we teach the history of Icelandic literature. So I have the first part. We begin in 453. We begin with the nosebleed. That's how Icelandic literature began. And this is, the death of Attila the Hun. That's of course much contested, but one version of it has that he died by nosebleeds, which is, interesting. I once had a horrible nosebleed that was very traumatizing, but I always knew it wasn't dangerous because, a nosebleed is only dangerous in very specific circumstances. So that's how Icelandic literature begins in this book. And then we go all the way to 2022. So we want the last chapter to be a year that hasn't started yet. So
I like it.
Yeah, so we are trying to make it more accessible in every way we can. So it's currently being layouted, and I hope it has to be out by Christmas because I'm teaching it in January.
Excellent. I'll look forward to seeing that. And thank you very much for answering all of our questions here, and for this discussion that branched out quite a bit. It's always great to talk to you, and I'll look forward to having you back sometime.
Yeah, I was very pleased and hope to be back at some point. So.
All right. Well, for now, thank you, Ármann. Thank you, Patreon. And I will wish everyone all the best.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.